From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, welcome to session on digital collections, K-12 classroom, connecting with teachers and students. It's a co-presentation by our three respective projects. Go ahead and do a quick introduction.
I'm Franky Abbott of the Digital Public Library of America, and I am the curation and education strategist at DPLA, and I have worked on our primary source sets project.
And I'm Stephanie Greenhut from the National Archives, and I'm the education technology specialist there and project manager of the docsteach.org project that we have.
And I'm Brian Ausland. I'm with Navigation North out of California, and we did the research, development, and design of Smithsonian's new Learning Lab system. Okay, so we have a plan for this presentation. We've got the first bullet done. We're going to take a high-level response to the 5 questions that we put in our session description. As a team, we've met a few times and talked about those questions respectively to our own experience and background. So it's going to be kind of a high-level thing, and then we're going to take time for questions to get into more detailed information based on what it is that you deem important or need to know about. But Robert Burns said something about plans. Part of our plan is this macro approach, and then the questions led us to get to some more details. And the reason for that is the more we met and talked about this, the three of us are really not talking about our own experience, we're talking about the experience of our projects, and they're huge. These could all easily be their own sessions. And so we're going to do our best to kind of just fly across the top of these bigger ideas and then go where you need us to go. So you're part of that plan. So if you can help us with, in that last part, to let us know what you need to know more about. And we've come to the conclusion that really, if you walk out of the room kind of clear about what our projects have respectively tackled and tried to understand and do, and what they continue to grow and want to do, and if you find that valuable or of use or of need for some of the work you're looking at, then really the best thing that could happen is you would develop a relationship with one of us or all of us, and we can extend the conversation beyond this presentation to help you or give you whatever we know and whatever we've learned through the process. So we're going to start with just a description about our projects very briefly that we are all involved with, and we'll start with Franky.
Sure. So you heard a little bit this morning about the primary source sets project. DPLA, as you know, is a big aggregator. We work with 1,900 institutions and 13 million items from those institutions. And part of the mission of DPLA is to get that content used. And an education audience is one of the possible audiences that might make use of cultural heritage content online. So we did a research year in 2014 to 2015, and then we organized an education advisory committee, of which we have a member in the audience. Hi, Ella. Which is a group of 10 educators in grades 6 through 14. They met with us. They helped us design a template for primary source sets, and then they helped us develop a collection of 100 of them, the last group of which just went up on Monday, which is exciting. Primary source sets at the DPLA are pretty simple, and we think reusable for teachers in a variety of ways. They are an overview, 10 to 15 selected and curated items from DPLA's partners' collections, and then a teaching guide with inquiry-based questions and activities that teachers can use to employ the primary source sets in the classroom. They're organized around topics in US history, literature, and culture, although we've made some very brief forays into world history in our most recent round. They are up online, you can see the URL. And our project of these 3 tackles some similar issues in that it is working with a specific group of digital content that is online, in this case from multiple institutions, but it is by far the youngest education effort on this panel. So we have benefited a lot from speaking with Stephanie and also Brian's team of folks at the Smithsonian. So thanks for being on a panel with me.
And just to tell you a little bit about DocsTeach, DocsTeach is, we call it the online tool for teaching with documents from the National Archives. As opposed to the DPLA primary source sets, this site is kind of a dinosaur, actually. We're in the midst of overhauling it right now to be a little fresher, but it's actually going to be 6 years old next month, which is pretty old for an interactive website like this. All of the, you can kind of get a hint at the main components here. It's really made up of activities and documents. And as you can imagine, the documents here are coming from the holdings of the National Archives. You've probably heard a little bit about the National Archives today, but we're an independent agency. We have billions of records from all 3 branches of government. One of the things that we try and do for DocsTeach, which is a site geared at teachers to be able to use for, to come up with teaching materials for their students. We don't take all of the digitized records that we have in the holdings of the National Archives. Our online catalog has thousands and thousands and thousands more, but what we're trying to do is to really pick the ones that we think would be useful tools for the classroom. And so, so we sort of curate the set in a way. It also would tend to be most useful in a history classroom, but there certainly are some materials that could cross over to world history, to language arts, even foreign language. We do have some records that fit there. We have, on the other side of things, the activities. It's kind of a toolbox for teachers. I always use describe it sort of like food or cooking, if you will, where we have these activities on the site where if you are a teacher and, just like now you're on your way home after work and you don't feel like putting together a dinner, you stop, you pick up takeout or something pre-made and it's ready to go. Just like that on the site, you can come find activities that are ready to use them in your classroom with your students. But sometimes you go the semi-homemade route, so you might make some mac and cheese and slip some broccoli in there. Excuse me, I have a toddler, so I'm always slipping in things like that. So what you can do on this site as a teacher, if you come, you can find an activity you like, but then you can modify it to fit your needs. So you might change the primary sources that are involved, swap out the instructions, that kind of a thing. Or you can go from scratch and use one of the tools that we have on the site to make your own entirely from scratch new online activities. And what the activities have their own unique URL that students can do online, or teachers could project it to use in the classroom. That kind of a thing. So we've got the online site, and then we developed an app as well that students can actually use to do the activities that their teachers have either found or created for them. So that's DocsTeach in a nutshell. Brian?
I didn't advance, I didn't know.
Oh, I'm sorry, I totally forgot.
Why don't you, because if you could explain it.
Sure, yeah, sorry about that.
I got that.
Are we on click? Yeah, so totally forgot to but one of the things I wanted to point out is we tried to put some of the control into the teacher's hands. We really wanted to create a tool that teachers could use. And so here you can see sort of the back end. Teachers are able to use these tools or templates that we have pretty easily and quickly to pull together activities that can really end up varying a lot.
I like how she describes her project as, would you say old, or it's a dinosaur. We actually valued their project because when we started working with the Smithsonian on the research, we were looking at, the Smithsonian had a long history of internally developing through central efforts with their educator teams, curriculum bundles and curriculum models for teachers to use. And they asked us to look and do an environmental scan of digital resource learning object sites that weren't packaging the curriculum as kind of locked up, ready to go curriculum, but in fact was allowing practitioners in the field to do manipulations of the curriculum. And at that time, 5 years ago, we only found 3 examples that had any real traction nationally, and the primary example we found was the DocsTeach site. And so we approached Stephanie and her team at that time. We said, whose crazy idea was this? It wasn't a lot of research to support at the time, so we knew they hadn't done a lot of that type of work, so we just wanted to know, like, it's a pretty bold move in this space. So I really like to acknowledge their work in this field because a lot of us have built upon it since then. Of course, with the Smithsonian, we also had, and we have, is there Smithsonian folks in the room today? I saw Sarah's here. Anyone else? Okay, so Sarah, don't share everything I say today about this. I'm not a Smithsonian person, so I was a person who came in and worked with them that they contracted to come in and help them think through this process and look at and perform research and look at data. But I was impressed upon just the sheer size of the bureaucracy and the deepness and the long-standing cultures of control. And really that became, like, they're like, so our real work is to figure out what teachers want. And we really quickly learned out, like, that wasn't the real work. The real work was addressing cultural shifts that would be required to do something similar to Docs Teach. So just a schematic that we developed for them at the time: 19 museums, 9 research centers, 1 national zoo, lots of stuff, lots of people, lots of history, lots of ego, lots of stuff going on, all corridors. And so we simply came in and we looked at this one piece of data which drove their work at the beginning. Was they said, well, 1995 to 2014, they had a 13.16% increase in physical visitors to any one of their places, and they had 135,000+ % increase in their digital visits. So they're like, what are we doing with that? They also received some funding to investigate this through Gates at the time, which said, we want you to do more to make the Smithsonian's assets more accessible to citizens that are geographically remote from the Smithsonian physically and are from certain demographics and populations within communities that will most likely never come to the Smithsonian in their lifetime. So they were looking at some of that data. So they said, well, we need to make better use of our web presence. And so one of their approaches, which was the sliver of the project that moved our way, was they'll make it really consumable and desirable for teachers to use, and they'll take it to kids in classrooms, and that will be one way to expose the Smithsonian to a large group of future U.S. citizens. They had this piece of research which drove some of their early efforts, and that was they had done this investigation piece for over 2 years, and they saw that teachers were readily disassembling all their beautiful curriculum, right? So teachers would take all of this valuable, structured, thoughtful, methodically designed curriculum and just pull it all apart. Like at the 3rd grade level in classes in Ohio and after-school programs in Oregon. And they said, that's disturbing. And so then the teachers in the data that we did as follow-up, because we were monitoring this through use data across a number of different state platforms at the time, the data showed that not only were teachers taking it apart, which they were saying, well, we can deal with, like, we'll figure out how to deal with that. The problem was the teachers valued the content, the Smithsonian content, as highly instructionally valuable. Was their first assertion, the single most important data point teachers gave us. They found great value in the instructional materials. They then promptly disassembled those instructional materials, for which they found valuable, because they said, well, we want to add more value to it. So they always knew they could improve it. The third thing was more disturbing to them, and that's what we showed, is that most those teachers who found value in the instructional content and had to do work without tools, but do work to, like, crop a picture out of one of their sites or take a paragraph of information, put it into a Word document, rewrite it in a way that was more accessible to their students, it was so cumbersome to them that they stopped using the materials at all. So we'd show this incredible drop-off where they'd come to the systems once. They had a 5+ minute engagement, which showed that and we could see what they were doing with the system and record it. And so to them, what was most disturbing was not that they were modifying the curriculum, it was that they found it so cumbersome they just didn't come use it at all, even when they assigned value to it. So that was one of their more significant findings. We did some work from there, and really our work was done directly with large groups of teachers. We did 3 years of research with teacher teams from all over the U.S. We had the teachers of the year from every single state that we had access to for the weeks that they were here in D.C. for the teacher of the year, trip to the White House, et cetera. Pearson would pay to have them out here a week in advance. The Smithsonian would get to work with them for certain hours of the day throughout those weeks, so we used that time to test teachers. That's one of the pictures that's up there. We worked with teachers through that process. We then created a field group of teachers across the U.S. that had a more diverse blue-collar approach to teachers, not the teachers of the year from every state, and from diverse communities. And then our second line of research was we distilled that down to 25 teachers who then gave us access to their classrooms. And from the teacher results, which were paper-based prototypes that then turned into technical prototypes, which then turned into web-based prototypes, we actually took the prototypes into the classrooms of these teachers, where the teachers, much to our amazement and horror, said, you work with our kids with your prototype. And so we then would spend 2 to 4 days, 2 hours a day, performing projects and activities as designed by the teachers with our prototype, and then the teacher said, you should co-teach this with us, and then you might understand where it works and doesn't work for the kids, which was very scary for lots of people on my side of the team. But what we ended up developing was a system of tools that are shown there where teachers could manipulate resources, annotate resources, resequence them, put informative assessment pieces. Students could do different things with the high-level imagery, mix and match content, resources. Teachers could roll assignments out through the system, and it could track that. And we took a very low-threshold approach so that we could have the teachers do some of the basic steps they do when developing curriculum and in engaging students in formative and summative activities. But then we had to make it so that all of these things, as beautiful as the system was and as eloquent as the design teams took effort to make it, that all of this could be ported out to things like Edmodo or Canvas by Instructure, or whatever they're using locally, since that's what they're invested in using. So that was the approach, and that was our brief covering of 3.5 years of research and development.
Sure. So we thought we would go through the questions briefly as a group that we promised to address in this session. Some of them, one of us is going to take a little stab at, and then others we're going to answer in a little bit more of a group kind of way. So I'm going to take question number 1, which is, what? Oh, yes. Okay. Question number 1. What is the value of education work for cultural institutions? I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to answer this question because DPLA is, of course, the owner of none of its own content, but we do work with lots of other institutions, and so I do interact with people from multiple institutional contexts to create the primary source sets. And I think for all of us, it's probably safe to say that the big exciting thing about education work is use, right? And education use, which is a particular kind of use in the world of copyright. People are generally a little bit more generous, a little more enthusiastic to connect their materials with the education audience. And also, often education work is a core part of a cultural institution's mission. So the idea of connecting with teachers and students is a piece of that. And finally, sometimes the idea or the promise of education use has in fact been a rationale for funding the digitization itself. So the idea that when this stuff, which is such great stuff, is online, that it will become useful for classrooms, in the state or across the country is kind of part of the reason that people embark on digitization projects in the first place. It's not the only reason, but it's a valuable reason. And so I think safe to say, from a use perspective, there's actually a tremendous amount in education work for cultural institutions, but it presents a series of big challenges, which we'll talk about in the answers to these questions as well. It's your turn.
I took question 2. And please appreciate the amount of time we spent researching this. The question is, what is the value of this content to teachers and students, and how do they use it? That's a kind of a big, loaded question. So bear with me on this slide. We published 3 separate folios of research on this topic, which all can be found online, and it's really exciting reading. I urge you to take an opportunity to nose through it. However, here's a distillation of what we were looking at. Some of the Pew studies was our first call information. That's internet has a major impact on 90% of teachers' ability to access content, resources, materials for their teaching. 90% of teachers are using search engines to find information on a daily basis. 84% using internet weekly to find content that will engage students. 80% are using internet weekly to help them create lesson plans. And this is Pew study from 2013, so it's only gone up from there when we did the original work with this a year into our project. Our findings were that teachers needed the content as delivered in these ways, this type of OER with tools that allowed them to manage how it's structured and delivered to students to be flexible. They valued that they could maximize the use of high quality images. They wanted variable manipulations with those images that weren't built in at the time and that weren't being released digitally for fear of printing and copyright infringement. So we had to overcome some of those hurdles, particularly with the National Portrait Gallery. Tools and suggestions to help adapt resources to diverse learners. They appreciated they could diversify 4 different learner types in their classrooms, which typically a single set of curriculum couldn't do or couldn't know how to do for a given teacher's kids. They wanted a dedicated space for collecting and saving resources. Some of the outcomes they were looking for that started to get to us to be more about pedagogy involved making content more inclusive, increasing learner engagement, localizing and personalizing content to their area. The example we had were the teachers in particularly California, but particularly Northern California, that do a real emphasis on Gold Rush, which they're not going to see from a curriculum that comes from outside of that area to the degree that they do that work there. Modification to support specific learner needs, diverse content types and sources, which they typically don't have access to, which could come through vehicles like this. Differentiate formative and summative materials. Particularly the formative pieces, they were more interested in delivering and creating contemporary content that was up to date, timely, something that doesn't typically get delivered to them in their traditional sources of instructional information and materials and resources. And support non-trad and emerging pedagogies, which is, as Lisa's team pointed out this morning, there's a real shift going on in K-12 with that textbooks aren't prepared to or structured to support cross-disciplinary instruction, STEM-based focus, all the way down into the lower elementary levels. So they need some flexibility to respond to those new pedagogical shifts that they're seeing and they're liking and wanting to take up on behalf of kids. So some of the other things that we had to point out was that the value of the content for the teachers was in, some of it was just in the digital delivery. So the teachers are having to have kids take high-stakes summative assessments in digital environments, by and large, in almost every state now, moving off of paper and pencil. And just the fact that they could move kids through some digital environments and iterations of analyzing, researching content, responding to questions, working collaboratively online, is helping kids be more prepared for when those types of high summative level events happen later in the school year. So that was an asset to teachers that they could do that. And they also said that the students tend to just be a little more engaged in the use of technology in their classrooms, and it was giving teachers kind of a guided vehicle to use that in that way.
This slide has less text on it than the slide before it. Question 3, we're going to answer in a little bit more of a group. What are the most important considerations when designing for this audience? This is another really big question, but 2 contributions from me and from our experience on the primary source sets. Number 1, there is a disconnect between the folks who organize and describe digital collections and the teachers who want to use them, and some of that disconnect appears in the way that objects are described in digital collections. So the way that metadata, which is in the best case scenario pretty comprehensive, appears and is useful to in a variety of audiences within the general public, is sometimes an information overload and requires a little bit of translation and sometimes some additional contextualization to make an object useful for the classroom. So I think one of the biggest roles that we play on our teams is that, with the assistance of lots of other people and teachers, is that role of translator between how an object is being described and how it arrives in a collection and how it might be slightly differently described and contextualized to put it in an education resource. So considering the kinds of translation that would be required of your digital collection items, which again are not necessarily inherently useful, they are made useful by education curation, I would say. And the second is probably pretty obvious that it's important to us on this stage, but if you are considering designing an education resource project from a digital collection, you have to engage teachers in your project in real ways. So they need to be part of a research process or the design process itself or the curation process. But it's, I think, pretty rare that cultural institutions have a huge number of people with an education background in their staff, and if you have that, that's terrific. But if not, there are creative ways to incentivize employ, otherwise engage teachers in the process of thinking through your education project and executing it. So that's a really big consideration.
I'm really going to piggyback on both of those points. I think Franky's first point about this kind of idea of translation is really important and something that we have seen a lot, especially, you know, even if it's just hiding some of the metadata that can be a bit overwhelming to both teachers and students, and providing context. You know, we have definitely always seen that the more we are able to do that, the more uptake there is of any given resource. I think that the second point about engaging teachers is really important too, because there's a lot of complexities when it comes to the teacher population that are worth understanding or trying to understand or acknowledging when you're creating education resources. And I actually came to the National Archives straight from the classroom. I was teaching 7th grade and then came on board at the National Archives. And I can remember thinking when I left that job, I need to remember that if I email these people and they don't email me back, not to take it personally, because they have no time to do it. And I've been out of the classroom now 8 years, and I'm kind of starting to forget a little bit. So I do think it's really important to bring in that perspective, that fresh perspective. But I think that translates into what you're designing for teachers too, because going back to the metadata, teachers don't have time to weed through a lot to get at what they want, and so I think the other aspect of that is that there was a time when it was really hard to find, if you were a history teacher, for instance, and you want to find some primary sources to bring into the classroom, it was really difficult to do that. And it is not the case anymore at all. In fact, it's the opposite, really. I think that it's overload. There's so much out there, and to go to all those sites and find one that you like best and evaluate the different sites and what you want to use, I mean, it's a lot, especially for a very time-crunched population to start with. So I think just, our central question is considerations designing for this audience. I mean, I think if you're designing something, what we have found that, the easier it is, the better, and not to make any statements about intelligence by any means, but just the straightforwardness is perhaps a better way to phrase it. Not a million accounts, you have taken into consideration school firewalls and things like that, but I think the most direct access and the most straightforward access can really be the best, and sometimes the cleanest access too, with maybe some of that metadata hidden, maybe some historical context, or whatever context whatever topic you're teaching, providing some of that. But so it does take a little bit of reframing, I think, the resources that we have. So again, I guess kind of going back on that word translation, I think it's a theme that's has come up a lot in our conversations about this. Go ahead, Brian.
So most important, I mean, that's kind of a hard thing to go on. And when talking to both these ladies, I was talking to them about making sure your metadata is transferable to systems like Learning Registry, so it can go out and propagate into the environments that teachers are already having promoted and they're using at their state and local levels. The game no more is, there's no more stake now involved in, well, how do we get them to our website to go from those other websites to get to our website? That's a losing game. The idea is, how do you get your materials and your content to make it to where they're already trained and adapted to use and funded to use? And so I was looking at that and talking about, we want to talk about metadata and discoverability, but really in talking to these two, and I said, what's really important, particularly listening to things this morning, I changed my mind and I said, I'm not sure that people recognize the transition that's happening right now in K-12. I don't know that even in K-12, I don't think we're fully got our heads wrapped around it. But in all reality, teachers by their nature will scavenge anything for classroom use and for teaching, and have a rich history and a deep-rooted inclination in their DNA to do that, and are really emerging right now, policy-wise, we're emerging from 20 years of very strict state and federal policy saying you may not do that. You are subverting the adopted curriculum aligned to these high-stakes standards, which are aligned to these high-stakes assessment. And it ran completely contrary to the natural processes and behaviors of most of our most highest skilled teachers, our most creative teachers. That was, and in fact, I was telling these two that it wasn't even 3 years ago that we were working on a state project in California, and we put a tool up where teachers could just go grab what we're now calling OER, which I don't know what we were calling it then. It's like it's all of a sudden it's here and it's new. But we have a term for it, OER, and we said, yeah, they can assemble it and then, you know, kind of create a little bit, create a background for it and kind of create a canvas for it and put some questions there. And we were told by the state academic deputy superintendent at that time at California, she said, you cannot have that tool in there. We cannot actively promote a tool that's allowing them to build curriculum, a third rail curriculum, outside of the adopted materials that is the third largest single expense in K-12. You're subverting that entire expense, which only falls behind salary and facilities in K-12. And I mean, that was it, and that was state to state. That we now sit in a day where just in the last 6 months, the Federal Department of Education has a director of OER, an open education initiative, and they're asking districts and states to sign on, which are signing on in droves, on open education and tools to allow teachers to go find wonderful resources as provided by many of the agencies represented in this room, and many others, and build good learning exchanges and activities for the students that they know so well, that they spend 180 plus days with in groups of 20 to 30 kids. Of course, that's who we want developing the curriculum, and that's what teachers want to do. And we're now in a place where we're basically, since probably the mid-90s, right, Letha? Just saying, by the way, yeah, you should do that. And teachers are like, great, thanks. We'll reconnect with that inner curriculum designer. So I urge people to recognize it's going to be a reawakening. It's going to be something, and in this time, it's very different than 20 years ago. There's so much for them to select from. If you thought teachers could do some incredibly sophisticated, crazy tapestries with just the things at their physical fingertips, is what it looked like when I was still in the classroom, what we're giving them access to now is going to be of incredible benefit to our students and our learners if we help them with that and give them tools to guide that process.
All right, so I didn't realize I was being a bit subversive when I was teaching, but but you know, so we want to talk a little bit about what this means to put this kind of control in teachers' hands. You know, what about handing materials over to the teachers as sort of raw materials and seeing what they come up with, and it's sort of you know, I think it's a bit of a trick question, really. I don't think we're ever putting control in the teacher's hands because they're taking it anyway. It's you know, they were taking control in the first place, but as Brian explained earlier, it was more of a manual cutting and pasting and pulling things together, using various other tools and platforms. And you know, I can remember when I first came to the archives, as I mentioned, I had just been teaching in the classroom, and you know, had come fresh off this subversive stint of cobbling things together, but that's what I knew everyone else to be doing too. You know, we never downloaded a lesson plan or found a lesson plan and used it as is. We're always pulling it apart, disassembling it, putting it with other pieces. You know, rarely teaching a lesson plan from start to finish in one class period because it might have been written for a 55-minute class period, and yours are actually 42 minutes because why they can't be even numbers, I don't know, but they can't. So but you know, you might not want a full lesson plan for 42 minutes. You might want activities here and there. So, you know, your class gets cut short, you can bump this 15-minute activity. You know, so we just knew that teachers were kind of teaching with chunks of activities and putting them together how they thought worked for their students in their classroom. And sometimes, you know, as Brian mentioned, for different classes, you know, for fourth period this way, for sixth period this way, because that's how they're going to get it. And so when we started thinking about creating what would become Docs Teach, we were thinking a lot about that. And so we just kind of made the decision, why not, you know, it's happening anyway. So what if we just give teachers a place to do it, let them do it here. And, you know, of course that meant, well, but this is on our website, so, you know, how are we going to do that? And what we decided to do is there's sort of a tiered publication system. So a teacher can publish an activity. It's available to other teachers that have logged into the site. So you're sort of registering and logging in and pulling up from this pool, but if you just happen to be a casual visitor and you come to the site, you only see these activities that the National Archives education staff has created. So they were still there, the value is there, but it's, you know, if you were not so familiar with the site, you wouldn't necessarily think that everything that is there was created by us. So that was one way that we kind of were able to do it and sort of address that fear that some people had of, you know, well, what if somebody creates a really bad activity, or, you know, we don't want to look bad. We, you know, we're sort of a model here. We you know, we want to have a good name. That's when we address that. But I think, you know, one part of this question we wanted to talk about, what are the advantages of giving this kind of control to the teachers? Well, you know, for us anyway, we currently on DocsTeach have 104 National Archives education staff created activities. But our users have created over 20,000 activities, and over 3,000 of those have been published. So it's obviously big difference if you log in and what is there, and the site's always changing, always growing. You know, and it's a way for us to do that without our staff constantly creating these new activities. It also meant a difference when we were designing the site, because we put a lot of time into thinking about the user experience in terms of building tools, not writing lessons. And so, you know, our staff's very familiar with our holdings and the kinds of primary sources we have in our holdings and how those might, you know, be useful in the classroom. And so what we decided to focus our efforts on was thinking about tools and ways that were broad, you know, broad themes about how you might use these in the classroom, turning those into real life tools on this website, and then the teachers can plug in different primary sources that they find. So it's putting it in their hands so that they can customize it for their classroom like they were going to do anyway. But now it's up and online, and, you know, their student can click on this URL without them having to create the web page or whatever. You know, and it also turned into kind of a tool that we can use ourselves. You know, we will use the site to, you know, if we do a conference presentation or a teacher workshop or something like that, we're able to use it. If we need to create education materials surrounding an exhibit, we can use this tool that we made, because it is you know, a template, really, multiple templates. There's 11 different tools, so, you know, we can use it ourselves in addition to teachers. But I think in my opinion, the biggest thing. The biggest reason, I guess, or to do this kind of thing is I will always remember I went and did a presentation over in Fairfax County in Virginia. I used to teach there, and I went back after I worked at the National Archives, and we had created DocsTeach, and did a presentation as part of their social studies secondary teacher in service. So it's all the middle school, high school social studies teachers in Fairfax County. And they asked me to do a DocsTeach presentation, but then they had this teacher that also wanted to, and I said, well, let's do it together. And you know, I just always, it made an impression on me, because he really could care less that I was there. He didn't care that I had helped create the site. He wasn't impressed in any way, shape, or form. All he wanted to do was get up there and show his work that he had done. And this, you know, it just really made me realize that this is his site too, and all the teachers that are using it, this is, you know, really their work that is there, and they really look at it as their site too. And, you know, I do think probably also from a more practical standpoint that, you know, that can help a little bit with word of mouth too when you're trying to promote your site. You know, we did zero marketing. We didn't promote the site at all, but you know, so all the growth that it has seen, you know, which has been steady, is, you know, I think in large part because of that kind of feeling of ownership that teachers have, and they share their activities and therefore are interested in sharing it with others. So I think there's real benefits to kind of handing that control over, even though, like I said, I don't really think it's going to happen anyway.
Franky, I'll let you just.
Sure.
Just hustle those.
Yeah, I'm going to really hustle because I'm the hustler in the roundtable because we do want to take some questions from you. So we wanted to end by thinking about useful first steps for folks who are maybe getting started with thinking about how to do education work with a digital collection. So our first piece of advice is, even though we've talked a lot and are going to talk again in a second about using teachers in the process, that does not mean that you don't have to do some really basic curriculum research on your side. So learn what inquiry-based instruction is. If you're going to design a project that's primarily for sort of a state history audience, like find and do some reading in your state history standards to figure out what is covered in them and what is not. If you're going to be terrified by broad ideas like the Common Core and you're working with digital primary sources, figure out where primary sources show up in the Common Core state standards. And if you're working with social studies and history, look at the C3 framework. It's useful to begin to develop a sense, even if you are not an educator, of what is and is not curricular and what folks might actually be trying to use your primary sources to do in an instructional way. Again, even if you're not going to be the expert on the team, I think you have to have some of that knowledge to start sorting through what is probably a large group of digital objects and figuring out which ones are more and less useful. We've talked about this a lot, but also find ways to involve teachers realistically, but iteratively in the process of building your project. So get them involved at several stages, get them to do some review, give you some feedback, get them involved in planning. Check in with them and see how they think what you developed is going and how useful they find it. And can't not emphasize that enough. And also, we've talked about this some already, but be willing to do some of the heavy lifting for teachers. Help with some of that initial sorting of content by doing your curriculum research, and also help with some of the burden of that active translation, that is transforming an initial version of metadata into potentially a more student and teacher friendly version of metadata. I know the folks on our education advisory committee have done a lot of that work, but it's tedious handmade work, and so you can help your project get a jump by learning those skills and doing that behind the scenes. And Franky, answer to question 5. So I know we only have just a couple minutes, but we really do want, as we said, to take some questions from the audience as well. Yes?
Can you give an example of providing context for metadata, about sort of translating metadata for the education audience?
Sure. Do you want me to?
I can if you would like, but.
You go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could mean a variety. You know, it could mean different things. In our context, we are. I have fellow staff members in the room, so there's a lot of archival speak going on in our online catalog, for instance, and so we pull resources from there. We pull the digital objects from there, and we do pull some of the metadata, but we don't pull all of it. And in addition, we will, sometimes it's not even creating. Sometimes it's, more I scavenge like nobody's business. Maybe it was in an exhibit that we had, and I'll go pull the exhibit label text. So it's sort of identifying, because our archival catalog might not have, we might know the photographer, we might know the local identifier, we might know the record group series and file unit, but that's not relevant in the classroom. And it's not relevant entirely, but it's good to know where information comes from for sure. But if we can provide a little bit of historical context in addition to that. Sometimes it's even, I will go in and we don't really know that much, but we know this is a photograph from a series of, Army Corps engineers, I'm not sure, and we could actually even just rephrase the metadata that we have, so we can say this photograph comes from a series of photographs taken at this time from the Army Corps of Engineers, or something like that. You know what I mean? So sometimes it's just rephrasing things.
Sometimes something is a known item. I would imagine you find these in National Archives where it's like a fairly famous document, but the record isn't super full about what it is, and so students or teachers might appreciate a couple sentences more of description, just saying, or you have a portrait of a famous person, painted in a particular year, but the description isn't making even a speculative connection between the time period of the portrait and what was going on in the person's life, right? So it's some of a combination of those things. I mean, obviously, we're not trying to write a story that we can't say existed.
Yeah, and we don't have time, so it is about doing it in an efficient manner too. It also can be renaming things that are, we have some naming conventions, in our field that might not translate as well for a student reading it, that kind of a thing.
And titling is actually the final thing. I mean, our project is very dependent on an item having the right kind of title, because that and a thumbnail are the thing that will attract somebody to learn more about it. And so if a title is like Man on Horse and that man is George Washington, then we want to get George Washington into the title of the item, right? Or else nobody's going to go look at Man on Horse in the context of a George Washington related primary source set, because they won't care, because they won't make that connection. So some of it is also like a more rearranging of information in the metadata than it necessarily is like, and sometimes it is building in some more story. I don't know. It kind of depends on the, is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just the other day, we renamed, we have in Act 2, aliens. I'm like, oh, that's the Alien and Sedition Act. Let's call it that instead, that kind of thing.
Or we did just an activity with teachers where we gave them a campaign prop from Abraham Lincoln's, as he was developing a campaign strategy and a run for the presidency, and his political party created the term rail splitter as a political term for him, and they were trying to paint a certain picture for the party of the day. So they have one of their, it looks like a hatchet, looks like an axe, but it's just a prop, it's all wood. And all the data about it is the type of wood, where the burn mark that's on it came from a fire in 1921 in a warehouse. And so we put it in front of teachers, and then this is where I advocate for like prototypes. We put it in front of the teachers, and they would see the metadata, and we had the docents and the curators for that particular piece and other pieces represented in the room to watch and observe as we work with these teacher teams. And we would just basically say, highlight the things you like, and our prototype would capture what teachers highlighted. Get rid of things that aren't of value to you. Assign a standard to this that you could potentially teach with this. Assign a topic to this or a concept you could. And we would just collect that data as part of our testing. And then we'd go back. So when we find things like the teacher, some teacher would the one I love is the teacher completely erased everything about it. And they put, this is what Abe Lincoln used to kill vampires with. And I thought one of the ladies from American History Museum was going to faint and fall on the floor. She was so upset that they typed that in there. But then the teacher put there, like we said, and explained why you made the mock teach did, and her explanation of this fourth grade teacher was, she said, to grab their attention and then to move them to a place of understanding what it is.
It's curricular.
Made perfect sense, right? But it was absolutely false. But that was the summer, right? That was the summer when that movie came out, which the curator wasn't familiar with that movie. So there was a reason.
To be clear, we're not advocating that type of metadata, but.
That's all, Brian.
I was saying, aside from pulling your own metadata, we were also trying to look at what the teachers find of value or not of value metadata, and if they could change it, how would they change it? And by the way, Smithsonian made a very bold step on that in their system. The teachers can write their own metadata, write their own descriptive data for instructional use, which actually is paradata. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but the resident metadata is still there for them to access and use as well. But they get to kind of forward what the kids see originally.
Let's take your question, because you have had your hand raised since the beginning, and then people can ask other questions maybe afterwards.
How much use are you actually getting from these resources? How many teachers do come to the sites? And those are some of the most relevant sites, right, in the US at this point.
So our site is young, which means that we're not going to be getting nearly the kind of traffic you are, because we've only been online for about 8 months. But our site, since it's been up, has already brought, I think, about 25,000 new users to DPLA as a whole. And the project has seen, in the hundreds of thousands of page views. We'd share some stats with you if you're interested. We have done a little bit of preliminary research about how often those are coming from, like, within school district IP addresses and things like that. But the DPLA's sort of next frontier for our project is an assessment of kind of exactly how the resources are being used and how often they're being used by random people on the internet versus people in actual classroom settings, which is, of course, something that happens anytime you put something up on the internet. Do you want to answer what you know about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to share specific numbers too. One thing I always really appreciated about going in and looking at our analytics is that there's a precipitous drop in July and August and December. And it always makes me so happy because it means that the audience we designed for is who is using the site. So it's great. We have, we're 6 years old, I guess, almost now. And we have had, I'm not going to compete with Learning Lab probably, but we've had over 40,000 registered users. But don't let that number fool you. That doesn't mean we have 40,000 people active on the site on any given month. But those are just our registered users who sign up, and we're also kind of trying to think about, okay, that's one other thing we realized, that we do get some other traffic besides the school related traffic, and others are using the site just to find the history enthusiast out there, because they like the search feature. We're constantly adding more primary sources to it. We have hundreds of thousands in our catalog, but we only have 8,000 primary sources there, because we are really trying to pick ones that we think are most useful. But we've had, I think we've had over like 12 million page views, and so we're what I like to see is the growth, the year-over-year growth we've really seen. And again, it's kind of fun because we haven't done any marketing, so it's just spreading word of mouth.
Did you want to say anything about that afterwards? We're over time.
Yeah.
We're over time.
We haven't even launched yet. It's available. You can go online. It's technically in beta. Their launch is in June. I guess what I can share with you is they haven't launched or done anything, and they have over 450 users that have just gone there and made accounts. And then their premise was that most people would just consume content and resources, not actually author or create, which is the research shows is probably accurate. But they planned on, in their beta, just an open beta, they planned on approximately 75 to 100 teachers creating accounts. Like I said, they have 450 plus now. And they thought that about 15% of those teachers would create stuff. And they have more like 87% of those teachers are creating stuff. And they thought that they might have somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 50 max learning collections authored by teachers. And they have 2,000. Wow. So, like I said, there is something afoot. There is a reemergence. And I also think there was something to be said for such diligence with the design and the UI and the testing. And it's honed specifically to allow teachers to come in pretty low thresholds and create. So.
Thank you. Come ask us other questions if you have them.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.